Okay, I think we can get started now. Thank you, everyone, for attending this information session this morning on the State Revolving Funds Resilience Guidance. This was developed in collaboration with other groups within the department, including Watershed and Land Management, formerly known as Land Use, also with the department's Office or Division rather of Climate Change Mitigation and Monitoring, as well as the Commissioner's Office. So there was quite a bit of an internal discussion and collaboration leading up to this. I also shout out to Jen Feltis and Samantha Thomas. Samantha Thomas, who will be presenting today, is the primary mover and author of this document. So thank you, Sam. Just kind of a foreword on how we've gotten to this point. Pre-Superstorm Sandy, there were basically only FEMA 500-year floodplain requirements in general throughout the department as benchmarks. Post-Superstorm Sandy, funding programs were directed to come up with some resilience guidance. That's what we've been using over the last 8-9 years. And then now with new federal mandates, as well as a state climate strategy, starting with the governor's office and matriculating down through DEP Senior Leadership Commissioner La Tourette, has resulted in developing this document. So, as I said, there will be time at the end for some questions. And without further ado, Sam.
Thank you, Charles. Hello, everyone. My name is Samantha. Today, I'm going to guide you through the Building Resilient Water Infrastructure Climate Change Resilience Guidance for New Jersey's Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF program. This guidance will be going into effect this fiscal year. Please save any of your questions until after the presentation. So thank you to those who put their name and affiliation in the chat. If you haven't done so, you can still do that. For now, remain on mute, and at the end of the presentation, we will give attendees the opportunity to speak. When you would like to speak, use the raise hand function to be called upon before unmuting yourself. If you are on the phone, try to catch our attention in between the other speakers. So we're going to go over a number of things, including the context of this guidance, what is required, where these requirements fit into the larger review process, and then we'll discuss the climate impacts considered under the guidance and take a deeper dive into the specifications of the mapping and the resilience assessment. Finally, we will discuss how to demonstrate the findings within the alternatives analysis. So what is the guidance? The resilience guidance was developed in response to federal and state initiatives. Executive Order 13690 recently amended EO 11988 concerning floodplains for federally funded projects to establish a federal flood risk management standard for federally funded projects. It also defines the floodplain through climate-informed approaches. This applies directly to all SRF programs in the United States. The guidance also fulfills the recommendation of the New Jersey Climate Change Resilience Strategy to enable climate-informed investments. In response to New Jersey's recent push to become more resilient to climate change, the department is incorporating climate change considerations into various programs, including changes in rules and permitting processes, as well as these new requirements for public financing. To be clear, the new guidance is not a rule and does not enforce mandatory actions for planning and design. The Water Bank is explicitly requiring applicants to consider resilience to climate change with the standards provided within the guidance. These projects are expected to already be permittable. As part of these considerations, there are new mapping and analysis requirements for review. While there is no strictly enforceable benchmark for resilience, the Water Bank will maintain discretion over eligibility for funding, ensuring that responsible public investments are made while allowing for flexibility and accommodation of specific project and community needs. The previous flood protection guidance used a tiered approach where any impacts to the floodplain must be justified. Given New Jersey's unique vulnerability to flooding and sea level rise, recent natural disasters and evolving climate science have stressed a need for further considerations. This new guidance is far more comprehensive, offering a framework for considering not just impacts to the floodplain, but the floodplain's impact to level of service and the community, given a range of present and future climate change impacts. New specific requirements for mapping and analyses will lend to the consideration of climate impacts for the alternatives analysis. Lastly, the guidance will hold more significant investments, such as new infrastructure and substantial alterations to a higher level of scrutiny. So taking a look at these requirements, we're going to look at the mapping element and then the resilience assessment. Mapping is foundational to visualizing the landscape of the project and exposure to potential impacts. Required maps for every project include the community served, locations of existing and proposed infrastructures, and the current mean water line for relevant bodies of water. Maps are also required showing fluvial flooding, coastal flooding, and storm surge extent when preliminary mapping shows impacts are near to or around the project, or when impacts are unknown. Later in the presentation, we'll go into more detail about these impacts. Climate change impacts are expected to be mapped on top of on-site topography, which has been verified by a professional surveyor to ensure that flood elevations are reflected accurately. If the regulatory flood hazard area design flood elevation set by the state of New Jersey is ever higher than those indicated in this guidance, the flood hazard area design flood must be mapped instead. There's also new requirements for a resilience assessment depending on the project type, scope, and level of vulnerability. The purpose of this assessment is to assist in development and justification of resilient projects by analyzing alternatives in 3 key areas. This includes the vulnerability of the asset, the tolerance for risk, and the project's contribution to resilience to the community and the water system. We are highly recommending that all applicants and authorized representatives, regardless of whether they are new to the program or not, attend a pre-planning meeting. During the pre-planning meeting, we will answer questions about the guidance and its requirements and determine whether a project requires a resilience assessment. For those of you who have funded a project through the water bank or are in the process of doing so, you are likely familiar with the alternatives analysis. The alternatives analysis is typically submitted with the planning document and contains project details as well as environmental and preliminary engineering information. The resilience requirements are being integrated within the alternatives analysis. Each alternative should consider future climate scenarios, risk tolerance, adaptive capacity, and resilience, with the proposed project having an in-depth assessment of how it will be resilient to impacts and reasons why some impacts are not avoidable. As part of the alternatives analysis, the resilience requirements will be reviewed before the planning document can be approved and the EDD can be issued. While maps of the floodplain were already required with the planning document, the new requirements will ensure that mapping is relevant to New Jersey climate science and lends to understanding the project's vulnerability to different impacts. So now we'll take a look at those specific climate change impacts. The 4 climate impacts utilized by this guidance are fluvial and coastal flooding, storm surge, and extreme precipitation. Fluvial flooding, which is governed by stormwater runoff, is represented by the 0.2% annual chance flood plus 1 foot. Coastal flooding, governed by the Atlantic Ocean, is represented by the 0.2% annual chance flood plus relevant sea level rise projections for that specific project. Storm surge extent is determined by the NOAA's sea, lake, and overland surges from hurricanes model for Category 1 hurricanes. And extreme precipitation projections, which have recently been developed, can be determined using the New Jersey Extreme Precipitation Tool, which is linked in the guidance. These projections will be most relevant to any stormwater projects that come through the program. So getting into these climate impact projections a little more, we'll start with fluvial flooding, which primarily occurs when a river or stream exceeds its channel capacity, causing it to overflow into the surrounding floodplain. It can be caused by heavy rainfall, illustrated by the flooding that occurred during Hurricane Ida, and can be exacerbated by land use changes and changes in the weather. Applicants will map any exposure to fluvial flooding by mapping the 0.2% annual chance flood, or the 500-year flood, plus 1 foot of safety factor. The flood elevation can be determined using FEMA flood insurance studies, flood profiles. Instructions for doing so will be provided to applicants along with the guidance. As mentioned, a resilience assessment may be required for certain projects that have high exposure to a fluvial floodplain, consist of a significant investment, are particularly vulnerable to flooding impacts, et cetera, et cetera. Coastal flooding can have a significant number of contributors, including but not limited to high tide, sea level rise, storm surge, and compounding flooding caused by heavy rainfall. Mapping exposure to coastal flooding will consist of mapping the 0.2% annual chance flood plus sea level rise projections at a selected planning horizon. The 0.2% annual chance flood elevations can be found in the transect tables within the FEMA flood insurance studies. The planning horizon to determine the sea level rise height will depend on the project details and the year of the planning document's approval. The minimum planning horizon is set at the loan term, meaning that a project with a 30-year loan term, which anticipates that its planning document will be approved before the end of 2029, will need to plan to 2060. In all cases, the applicant must justify the use of the minimum standard if they are not adopting a 2100 planning horizon. New construction and substantial alterations must use the planning horizon at 2100 unless they can demonstrate infeasibility. Applicants will map the storm surge extent as well as local mitigating infrastructure such as levees, berms, flood walls, and tide gates. Storm surge is mapped using the NOAA's slosh model for Category 1 hurricanes to represent potential extent, showing levels of inundation for resilience considerations. Any analysis of storm surge should include direct and indirect disruptions, including flooding hazards, sustained winds, or failure of notable flood mitigating infrastructure. There is no mapping element for extreme precipitation, but applicants are expected to describe whether and how the project is impacted by increased extreme precipitation projections for either mid-century or end of century, and to justify the use of either projection. This will likely only be relevant for stormwater projects, but it is important for applicants to attend the pre-planning meeting and to coordinate with stormwater group for permitting and to understand the project specific needs. If a resilience assessment is required for the project, the applicant may use analytical and technical means that best suit their project and their situation. However, certain elements must be included and the water bank maintains discretion over the adequacy of such assessments. To start, the scope of the project will have implications to the extent of the assessment and the review process. As discussed previously, new water infrastructure providing essential services and substantial alterations where the cost is more than 50% of the existing infrastructure must evaluate sea level rise at 2100 and use end of century extreme precipitation projections, if applicable. These projects constitute significant investments and will be held to a higher level of scrutiny for review. Applicants should carefully consider constructing decision matrices and amply justify the selected alternative. The resilience guidance offers a detailed framework for the essential components of the resilience assessment. It outlines a clear path for assessing both the vulnerability of individual assets and the project's contribution to community level resilience. The resilience assessment must evaluate asset exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity to climate change impacts to determine the vulnerability of that asset. It must also detail consequences for a disruption to level of service to determine financial, environmental, and public health and safety risk tolerances. The specific methodologies used may vary. The essential element is to capture a holistic view of the project's and the community's resilience. Reviewers will assess the adequacy of mapping and the quality of the resilience assessments with attention to projects which are most vulnerable or critical for level of service. The resilience assessment, if utilized, should be a critical and persuasive tool for justifying the selected alternative, but it is also a critical tool for scoping the alternatives. Use the analysis to explore how each alternative might avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts as you are developing the alternatives. Justifying the selected alternative within an alternatives analysis involves presenting a clear, rational, and data-driven argument for why a particular option is the most suitable among the considered alternatives. This uses an evaluation based on predefined criteria such as cost, environmental impact, feasibility, community need, regulatory compliance, and resilience. The justification of the selected alternative must incorporate the findings of the mapping and the resilience assessment. This includes demonstrating how the chosen alternative best addresses the vulnerabilities identified and how it manages risks to potential climate change impacts. The Building Resilient Water Infrastructure Climate Change Guidance can be found on the Water Infrastructure Investment Plan website on the How to Apply page. The Water Bank has also developed a supplemental guide and checklist for applicants, which will be provided by Water Bank staff. If you have any questions or comments, you can take your time to go over the guidance following this meeting and send them to me at samantha.thomas@dep.nj.gov. Please send any questions or comments within 2 weeks of this presentation to allow time for us to form a response. You can also raise your hand now to be called upon. We have experienced members of our team with us today, and we'll be able to answer any questions you have, or you can, when you submit an application with us, we can also answer questions at that time. Thank you.
We have one hand so far. Anthony?
Yes. Will the presentation slides be available online? And I guess my other question was related to level of service definition and evaluation. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So for something like potable drinking water, that's maintaining the supply of safe drinking water to the residents of a community. On the wastewater side of things, it would be maintaining permit compliance and public health and safety.
Stephen?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. Question, could you give us a date of when this is going to be applicable to applications?
So where we are now with this is projects that have approved planning and have submitted a complete design that's been reviewed. We will consider them so-called grandfathered from this process because we understand that if a project's gone all the way through the environmental impact analysis, has gone through a permitting process, received permits, they have a design in place, that it's difficult to go back from there. So somewhat similar to what US EPA imposes for things like Buy America, Build America. If a design has already been submitted and reviewed, then you're considered grandfathered.
Okay, thank you, Charles.
So there may be, and just a caveat on that, and I don't think there are too many examples of this, though from time to time, for various reasons, projects do not fully progress through the application process. So planning may have been submitted and approved and even permits applied for. And then, 5 years or more go by and, there could be any number of reasons why a project doesn't move forward. We would want an applicant to at least take a look at whether anything is significantly changed in terms of resilience for their particular project.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Has the DEP or anyone involved in this actually prepare one of these reports to see what this is potentially going to cost applicants and time and money to prepare for these types of reports?
So as this guidance was being prepared, part of it was Samantha surveying other states throughout the nation, as well as US EPA. So what other states were doing, what the feds are doing for federal projects, and we're confident that this is very consistent with that. I think one of the major things that is kind of an adjustment for those coming through the program are the enhanced mapping requirements. So previously, you'd have your project site mapping, you would have environmentally sensitive area mapping, et cetera. So this does go beyond that to take a deeper look into sea level rise or floodplain issues.
Okay. Thank you.
Michael?
I have to unmute. I guess my question is, in the presentation you were talking about the flood level plus 1 foot, but I think the guidance, as I read through it quickly, talks about it would be adjusted based upon the rule that was adopted last week, I guess. So is that going to be plus 1 foot or plus 3 feet?
Michael, what rule are you referring to?
The inland flood rule.
Sam, if you have any input on that, I think that's probably a question we'll table and get back to you on.
I do think I can answer that question. So
Oh, great.
our guidance uses the 0.2% annual chance flood plus 1 foot, while the inland flooding rule uses it's the 1% annual chance flood plus 3 feet. So they are different benchmarks, but the guidance does require applicants to use whichever flood elevation is highest.
Okay, and I had a question on the mapping, where I think you just sort of touched on, in the past, mapping would have to include the project site or wherever the project was. And as an example, in our case, most of our projects have been on our, that we had loans on, were on our treatment plant site, so we dealt with those issues. But if I understand the mapping requirement, that would now include mapping our whole service area, which for us is relatively small, but if you're a regional authority, that could be a pretty big area. So I just sort of like what that the mapping sounds like that could be a extensive project.
Understood. That's something we'll take back and we will address. We're probably going to develop a frequently asked questions document, so we can address that in an FAQ. just to provide more clarity.
Thank you, Michael. Aaron?
Yes, good morning. I had a question. So during the pre-planning meeting, there would be some sort of preliminary review, right, for the extent of this analysis that would have to be performed. Is there an expectation for documentation to be provided prior to that meeting, during that meeting, to be able to have those discussions?
That would be helpful. There's always the opportunity to have a follow-up meeting to the pre-planning meeting to go into more detail after we collectively assess a particular project. And I think it's going to be geographically dependent in large part. So there will be many project types in many different locations of the state where resilience is generally not an issue. And then there are other areas of the state and types of projects where resilience almost certainly will be an issue. So, we'll work it out through the process. Any information provided in advance is always helpful, but it's not mandatory.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I don't see any hands. Oh, here we go. Eleni?
Hi, friends. My question is, would this change imply that there would be more money offered in the intended use plan for SFY 25 for resiliency projects? I know that we had some money coming in through the American Rescue Plan. And as Stephen mentioned, this is going to be a higher cost impact on the projects. I was just wondering if this would help a project rank higher if it does apply.
So we have not received any additional American Rescue Plan monies. In terms of resilience eligibility for ARP funds, that's on the drinking water side of things. We do intend, as we go through SFY 24, to see what the velocity and demand is for those ARPA funds as currently defined in the intended use plan. And if we do see a reason to issue a change to that eligibility, we'll pick it up at that time. But as far as the ARPA funds, we are adequately subscribed, so to speak, with projects that are eligible, that we don't anticipate changing those guidelines. Now, as far as us moving into other state fiscal years, these things certainly would be considered in the intended use plan and any potential changes to the project priority ranking system.
Thank you.
And as always, and Eleni, you have commented on IUPs in the past. So for those on this call that may not have attended an intended use plan rollout or commented, we really do value the input from the communities that are receiving the funding, what their thoughts are on how money should be allocated. So as those comments can come in at any time to the program. We're open to that, but certainly during that whole drafting of an intended use plan and going through the hearing process, that's a critical time to get those comments.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? You can also drop it in the chat if you need.
I have one last comment. So
Yes.
I don't think I fully addressed although it's kind of implied, but I want to make it explicit. So depending on how things work out, there may or may not be principal forgiveness associated with any of this effort to prepare the resilience plan, but it certainly will be eligible under project planning and design financing.
Noted.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions, suggestions?
Well, the only suggestion I would have is as you're starting to draft the intended use plan for SFY 25, take into consideration a proactive PF category for those that are going to be doing these plans in advance of projects. I think that incentivizes applicants to have a clearer picture of what they're up against for future work. Just that is the dangling carrot to get anyone really motivated to do certain things and change the way of addressing projects. Just food for thought. It does go a long way.
Thank you.
Much like the asset management plan. After the WQAA, everybody was like licking their wounds. They had to do an asset management plan, and those that took advantage of the AMPPF, no one regretted doing that. Thank you for the presentation and the platform to vocalize any questions or concerns. It does take a little time to let it all sink in. So I think part of the silence is like, all right, let me fully understand what is happening and how those impacts will affect projects. But I definitely appreciate the dialogue and the email that we can send questions to, and that we have a 2-week period you mentioned, right?
Yes.
An email would be sufficient, right? We can do informal comments and questions.
Yes.
Yes.
And we'll drop Samantha's email in the chat.
Perfect.
And then
Thank
we
you
are
all.
also going to be posting this session on the WIP website. Is that correct, Jen?
That is correct.
Okay, if there's no further questions or input at this time, thank you everyone for attending. Appreciate your interest.